Good morning. Happy Tuesday, everybody. I'm Charlotte, and this is Quarantine Storytime, where we've been using our shelter in place from COVID-19 to read some classic literature. And we decided to pick one of the longest books in English language. Well, it's not even an English book. It is The Russian War and Peace by Tolstoy. So we've been reading it for a couple months now. We're a little over halfway done, which is a little bit disappointing because by my math, it's like 1,200 pages. If I try to do 12 pages a day, that's 100 days. We're doing 5 days a week, so that works out to 20 weeks, which works out to approximately 5 months. But at this rate, I'm guessing we'll be closer to 6 or 7 months. So I don't know if we can maybe make up some time. I'm definitely going to try to read a good 12 to 13 page chunk today, but hopefully I'll try to be conscious of that in the coming days and weeks to maybe push it a little bit more so we can gain a little more ground. All right, so we're in volume 3, part 1. We will be starting with section 12 and reading through section 17 if you're following along. If you missed a section, remember you can always check back on the War and Peace playlist. If I missed a day, and so you're not sure if you've missed a day, just go check the playlist and just see what's there, see what you've listened to, what you haven't, the easiest way to go about it. And even if you just need a quick recap about maybe something. The last time we were reading about the Russian campaign against the Napoleon's invasion, so we're in 1812 now. Napoleon has invaded through the Polish provinces and is heading into Russia. And the Russian army is split up into 3 armies, and it's sort of stalled out between all these different camps of thought about how to address it. And everyone is really unspokenly nervous about Napoleon, and the Russian sovereign is with the army, but he's not leading it. Prince Andrei Bolkonsky is there, having broken off, having had his engagement with Natasha Rostov broken off. He's there. He was going to try to find Anatoly Kuragin, the man who was mostly responsible for this, and hopefully kind of maybe get him into some kind of a duel, but he's not there, and he's sort of also happily settling into his renewing his military service and his military life, and just taking him away from the cares of everyday life. So as we pick up in section 12, I think there'll be more talk about the military campaign, but it looks like now from possibly from Nikolai Rostov's perspective, but we'll see. All right, so without too much further ado, let's begin. Section 12. Before the opening of the campaign, Rostov received a letter from his parents in which, informing him briefly of Natasha's illness and her break with Prince Andrei, this break was explained to him by Natasha's refusal. They again asked him to resign from the service and come home. Nikolai, on receiving this letter, did not even attempt to ask for a leave or resignation, but wrote to his parents that he was sorry about Natasha's illness and her break with her fiancé, and that he would do everything possible to fulfill their wishes. To Sonia, he wrote separately, "Adored friend of my soul, nothing save honor could keep me from returning to the country. But now, before the opening of the campaign, I would consider myself dishonorable, not only before all my comrades, but also before my own self, if I were to prefer happiness to my duty and love for the fatherland. But this is our last separation. Believe me, right after the war, if I am alive and you still love me, I will abandon everything and come flying to you to press you forever to my ardent breast." Indeed, only the opening of the campaign detained Rostov and prevented him from coming, as he had promised, and marrying Sonia. Autumn in Otrudno, with its hunting, and winter with Christmas time and Sonia's love, had opened before him the prospect of quiet, gentlemanly joys and a tranquility he had not known before, and which now beckoned to him. A nice wife, children, a good pack of hounds, 10 or 12 lashes of dashing boar's eyes, husbandry, neighbors, local elections, he thought. But now there was the campaign, and he had to stay in the regiment. And since it had to be so, Nikolai Rostov's character was such that he was content with the life he led in the regiment and managed to make that life pleasant for himself. On returning from leave, joyfully welcomed by his comrades, Nikolai had been sent for a remount and had brought excellent horses from Little Russia, which pleased him and earned him the praise of his superiors. During his absence, he had been promoted to captain, and when the regiment was put on wartime status with an increased complement, he was again given his old squadron. The campaign began. The regiment was moved to Poland. The pay was doubled. New officers arrived, new men and horses, and above all, that excitedly cheerful mood spread around which accompanies the beginning of war. And Rostov, conscious of his advantageous position in the regiment, gave himself up wholly to the pleasures and interests of military service, though he knew that sooner or later he would have to leave them behind. The troops returned from Vilna for various complex governmental, political, and tactical reasons. Every step of the retreat was accompanied by a complex play of interests, conclusions, passions in the general staff. Yet for the hussars of the Pavlogradsky regiment, this whole march in retreat during the best period of summer, well provided with supplies, was the simplest and merriest affair. To be despondent, to worry, to intrigue was possible at general headquarters, but in the depths of the army no one even asked himself where he was going or why. If they were sorry to be retreating, it was only because they had to leave their homey quarters or a pretty Polish pana. If it did not enter anyone's head that things were bad, then, as a good military man should, the one whose head it had entered would try to be cheerful and not think about the general course of things, but about the matters closest to him. First, they cheerfully camped near Vilna, making the acquaintance of the Polish landowners and waiting and performing reviews for the sovereign and other high commanders. Then orders came to retreat to Swiankiani and destroy the provisions that could not be taken along. Swiankiani was memorable to the hussars only because it was a drunken camp, as the whole army named their stopping place there, and because there were many complaints against the troops who, taking advantage of the order to gather provisions, also gathered horses, carriages, and rugs from the Polish gentry. Rostov remembered Swiankiani because on the first day they entered this little town, he had dismissed his sergeant major and had been unable to handle all the drunken men of the squadron, who, without his knowledge, had gotten a hold of 5 barrels of old beer. From Swiankiani they retreated further and further towards the Drissa, and then again retreated from the Drissa and were now approaching the Russian border. On the 13th of July, the Pavlogradskys were to take part in serious action for the first time. During the night of the 12th of June, on the eve of action, that's weird. It said the 13th of July and then it said the 12th of June. Hopefully that'll be cleared up. During the night of the 12th of June, on the eve of action, there was violent rain and thunderstorms. The summer of 1812 was generally remarkable for its storms. 2 of the Pavlogradsky squadrons made their bivouac in the middle of a rye field, already in ear, but totally trampled down by cattle and horses. It was pouring rain, and Rostov, with the young officer Ilyin, whom he patronized, was sitting under a hastily slapped together lean-to. An officer of the regiment with long mustaches that continued across his cheeks, who was coming back from the staff and got caught by the rain, stopped to see Rostov. "I'm coming from the staff, Count. Have you heard about Raevsky's feat?" The officer recounted the details of the Battle of Saltavno, which he had heard at the staff. Rostov, hunching his shoulders as the rain ran down his neck, was smoking his pipe and listening inattentively, glancing now and then at the young officer, Ilyin, who huddled up to him. This officer, a 16-year-old boy who had recently joined the regiment, was now in relation to Nikolai what Nikolai had been in relation to Denisov 7 years ago. Ilyin tried to imitate Rostov in everything and was in love with him like a woman. The officer with the double mustaches, Zrdzihinsky, was pompously telling about how the Sultanovo Dam was the Russian thermopile, and that on that dam General Raevsky had performed a deed worthy of antiquity. Zrdzihinsky recounted the deed of Raevsky, who had led his 2 sons onto the dam under fierce gunfire and had gone into the attack alongside them. Rostov was listening to the story and not only said nothing to confirm Zrdzihinsky's raptures, but, on the contrary, had the look of a man who is ashamed of what he is being told, though he had no intention of objecting. After the campaigns of Austerlitz and of 1807, Rostov knew from his own experience that, when telling about military events, people always lied, as he himself had lied in telling about them. Second, he had enough experience to know that in war everything goes on quite otherwise than what we can imagine or recount, and therefore he did not like Zdrzhinski's story, and did not like Zdrzhinski himself, who, with his mustaches growing across his cheeks, had the habit of bending close to the face of the one he was telling his story to and crowding him in the crowded lean-to. Rostov silently looked at him. First of all, it surely must have been so confused and crowded on the dam being attacked that even if Raevsky did bring his sons there, it wouldn't have affected anyone except a dozen or so men who were right there with him, thought Rostov. The rest couldn't have seen how Raevsky went across the dam and with whom. But even the ones who saw it couldn't have felt much enthusiasm, because what did they care about Raevsky's tender paternal feelings when it was a matter of saving their own skins? Besides that, the fate of the fatherland didn't depend on taking or not taking the Sultanovo Dam, the way they say it was the Thermopyle, and therefore why offer up such a sacrifice? And then why get your children mixed up in it, in a war? I wouldn't leave my brother Petya into it, or even Ilyin, a nice boy, but a stranger to me. I'd try to find some safe place to put him, Rostov went on thinking as he listened to Zdrzhinski. But he did not voice his thoughts. He already had experienced that too. He knew that this story contributed to the glory of our arms, and therefore one had to make it seem that one did not doubt it. And so he did. Anyhow, I can't stand it, said Ilya, noticing that Rostov did not like Zdrzhinski's conversation. My socks and my shirt and under me, it's all soaked. I'll go and find some shelter. The rain seems to be letting up. Ilya left, and Zdrzhinski rode away. 5 minutes later, Ilyin, splashing through the mud, came running to the lean-to. Hurrah! Let's go quick, Rostov. I found it. A tavern about 200 paces from here. Our boys are already there. We can dry out, and Marya Genrinkovna's there. Marya Genrinkovna was the wife of the regimental doctor, a young, pretty German woman whom the doctor had married in Poland. Either because he lacked means or because he did not want to part with a young wife so early in their marriage, the doctor took her along everywhere with the Hussar regiment, and his jealousy had become a habitual subject of jokes among the Hussar officers. Rostov threw on a cloak, told Lavrushka to bring the things, and went with Ilyin, here slipping in the mud and there splashing straight on under the subsiding rain, in the evening darkness, occasionally broke by distant lightning. Rostov, where are you? Here. What lightning, they said to each other. Section 13. In an abandoned tavern before which stood the doctor's little kibitka, there were already some 5 officers. Marya Genrikovna, a plump flaxen-haired German in a bed jacket and nightcap, sat in the front corner on a wide bench. Her husband, the doctor, was asleep behind her. Rostov and Ilyin, greeted with merry exclamations and guffaws, came into the room. Hey, aren't you having fun? Rostov said, laughing. And why, are you missing it? Fine ones, then drench. Don't get our drawing room wet. Don't get Marya Genrikovna's dress muddy, some voices answered. Rostov and Ilyin hastened to find a corner where they could change their wet clothes without offending Marya Genrikovna's modesty. They went behind a partition, but the little closet was entirely taken up by 3 officers playing cards on an empty box with a single candle on it, who absolutely refused to let them in to change. Marya Genrikovna allowed them to take her skirt, using it as a curtain, and behind that curtain Rostov and Ilyin, with the help of Lavrushka, who had brought their packs, took off their wet clothes and put on dry. A fire was made in the broken stove. They found a board and, placing it on 2 saddles, covered it with a horse blanket, found a samovar, a cellaret, and half a bottle of rum, and the officers, having invited Marya Genrikovna to be hostess, crowded around her. One offered her a clean handkerchief to wipe her lovely little hands. Another put a jacket under her feet so that they would not get damp. Yet another screened the window with his cloak to keep out the draught, and yet another fanned the flies away from her husband's face so that he would not wake up. Let him be, Marya Genrikovna said with a timid, happy smile. He's sleeping well, as it is after a sleepless night. Never, Marya Genrikovna, the officer replied. We must wait upon our doctor. Maybe he'll pity me when he's cutting off my leg or arm. There were only 3 glasses. The water was so dirty that it was impossible to tell whether the tea was strong or weak, and the samovar only held water enough for 6 glasses. But more pleasant it was to receive one's glass in turn and buy seniority from the plump little hands of Marya Genrinkovna with their short, none too clean nails. All the officers, it seemed, were actually in love with Marya Genrinkovna that evening. Even the officers who were playing cards behind the partition soon stopped playing and went over to the samovar, yielding to the general atmosphere of courting Marya Genrinkovna. Marya Genrinkovna, seeing herself surrounded by such brilliant and polite young men, shone with happiness. However, she tried to hide it, and however timid she became at every movement her sleeping husband made behind her back. Of spoons, there was only one. Sugar was more plentiful than anything else, but they still could not stir at the same time, and so it was decided that she would stir the sugar for each of them in turn. Rostov, receiving his glass, poured some rum into it and asked Marya Genrinkovna to stir it. "But do you take it without sugar?" she asked, with the same smile as if everything she said and everything the other said was very funny and had some other meaning. "Never mind the sugar, I just want you to stir it with your little hand." Marya Genrinkovna smiled and began looking for the spoon which someone had already snatched up. "Use your finger, Marya Genrinkovna," said Rostov. "That will be even nicer." "It's too hot," said Marya Genrinkovna, blushing with pleasure. Ilya took a bucket of water and poured a drop of rum into it, came to Marya Genrinkovna, asking her to stir it with her finger. "This is my cup," he said. "Only dip your finger into it and I'll drink it all." When the whole samovar had been drunk, Rostov took the cards and suggested a game of kings with Marya Genrinkovna. They drew lots for who would be Marya Genrinkovna's partner. The rules of the game were, at Rostov's suggestion, that whoever was the king had the right to kiss Marya Genrinkovna's hand, and that whoever was left the knave would go and prepare a new samovar for the doctor when he woke up. "And what if Marya Genrinkovna is the king?" asked Ilyin. "She's the queen as it is, and her orders are law." The game had only just begun when the doctor's tousled head suddenly rose up behind Marya Genrinkovna. He had been awake for a long time and listening to what was being said, and he clearly found nothing gay, funny, or amusing in all that was being said and done. His face was sad and glum. He did not greet the officers, scratched himself, and asked to be allowed to step out because they tried to bar his way. As soon as he left, all the officers burst into loud guffaws, and Marya Genrinkovna blushed to the point of tears and became still more attractive in the eyes of all the officers. When he came back in, the doctor said to his wife, who had already stopped smiling so happily and looked at him, fearfully awaiting her sentence, that the rain had stopped and they had to go and spend the night in their kibitka, or else everything would be stolen. "But I'll send an orderly." "2 orderlies," said Rostov. "Come on, doctor." "I'll stand watch myself," said Ilyin. "No, gentlemen, you've had enough sleep, and I haven't slept for 2 nights, the doctor said, and gloomily sat down beside his wife, waiting for the game to end. Seeing the gloomy face of the doctor looking askance at his wife, the officers grew still merrier, and many could keep from laughing, for which they hastily tried to find plausible pretexts. When the doctor left, taking his wife along and settled with her in the little kibitka, the officers lay down in the tavern, covering themselves with their wet greatcoats. But for a long time they did not sleep, now talking, remembering the doctor's fright and his wife's merriment, now running out to the porch and reporting on what was going on in the kibitka. Several times Rostov covered his head and tried to fall asleep. But again someone's remark would distract him, again a conversation would begin, and again there would be causeless, merry, childlike laughter. Section 14. It was past 2 o'clock and no one had slept yet when the quartermaster appeared with orders to set out for the little village of Ostrovno. Still with the same talk and laughter, the officers quickly began to get ready. Again they set up the samovar with dirty water, but Rostov, not waiting for tea, went to his squadron. Dawn was breaking, the rain had stopped, the clouds had scattered, it was damp and cold, especially in the still wet clothes. Leaving the tavern, Rostov and Ilyin in the half-light of dawn peeked into the doctor's little kibitka, its leather glistening from the rain, and from the apron of which the doctor's legs stuck out, and in the middle of which they could see his wife's nightcap on the pillow and her sleepy breathing. "She's really very sweet," Rostov said to Ilyin, who was leaving with him. "A lovely woman," Ilyin replied, with a 16-year-old's earnestness. Half an hour later, the lined-up squadron was standing on the road. The command, "Mount up," rang out, and the soldiers crossed themselves and began to mount up. Rostov, riding ahead, gave the command, "March!" and stretching out 4 abreast the hussars with the sound of hooves splashing on the wet road, the clank of sabers and quiet talk, started down the big birch-lined road in the wake of the preceding infantry and artillery. The ragged bluish-purple clouds, turning red in the east, were driven quickly by the wind. It was growing lighter and lighter. The short, curly grass that had always grown on the sides of the country roads was clearly visible, still wet from last night's rain. The hanging branches of the birches, also wet, swayed in the wind and shed bright drops sideways. The soldiers' faces could be seen more and more clearly. Rostov rode with Ilian, who never lagged behind him, along the side of the road between the double rows of birches. While on campaign, Rostov allowed himself the liberty of riding a Cossack's horse instead of a regimental one. A fancier and a hunter, he had recently obtained for himself a fine, big, dashing dawn horse, light chestnut with a white mane and tail, on which no one could outgallop him. It was a pleasure for Rostov to ride the horse. He thought about the horse, about the morning, about the doctor's wife, and never once thought about the impending danger. Formerly going into action, Rostov had been afraid. Now he did not feel the least fear. He was not afraid, not because he was used to gunfire, one cannot get used to danger, but because he had learned to control his soul in the face of danger. He got used, going into action, to thinking about everything except what would seem more interesting than anything else, the impending danger. However hard he tried, however much he had reproached himself for cowardice during his first period of service, he had been unable to achieve this, but now with the years it had become by itself. He was now riding beside Ilian between the birches, occasionally pulling leaves off the branches that happened to be in his way, occasionally touching the horse's flank with his foot, occasionally handing his finished pipe without turning around to the hussar behind him. All with such a calm and carefree air as though he were just out for a ride. He felt pity looking at the troubled face of Ilian, who was talking much and anxiously. He knew from his own experience that tormented state of awaiting fear and death in which the ensign himself found himself. He knew that nothing but time would help him. The sun had only just appeared in the clear space under a cloud when the wind died, as if not daring to ruin this lovely summer morning after the storm. The drops were still falling, vertically now, and all became still. The sun came out completely, appeared on the horizon, and vanished into the long, narrow cloud that stood above it. A few minutes later, the sun appeared still more brightly on the upper edge of the cloud, tearing its edge. Everything lit up and glistened, and along this light, as if in response to it, cannon fire rang out ahead. Before Rostov had time to think and determine how far away those shots were, Count Osterman, Tolstoy's adjutant, came galloping from Vitebsk with orders to proceed down the road at a trot. The squadron overtook the infantry and the artillery, which also speeded up, and went down a hill, and passing through some empty, deserted village, rode uphill again. The horses began to lather. The men's faces became flushed. "Halt! Dress ranks!" rang out the order of the division commander ahead. "Column right, march!" came the command from ahead. And the hussars, following the line of troops, went to the left flank position and stopped behind our Uhlans, who stood in the front line. To their right, our infantry stood in a dense column. This was the reserve. Higher up the hill, in a perfectly clear air, in the slanting, bright morning light just on the horizon, our cannon could be seen. Ahead, beyond a hollow, the enemy's columns and cannon could be seen. In the hollow, our front line, which had already gone into action, could be heard merrily exchanging claps with the enemy. As if by the sounds of the most cheerful music, Rostov felt cheered at heart by these sounds, which he had not heard for so long. Trap-tat-tat-tap. Several shots clapped out, now together, now in rapid succession. Then all fell silent, and then came the crackling again, as if someone were walking on firecrackers. The hussars stood for about an hour in the same place. A cannonade began. Count Osterman and his suite rode up behind the squadron, stopped, talked with the commander of the regiment, and rode off towards the cannon on the hill. After Osterman rode off, a command to the Uhlans was heard. "Column, form up for the attack." The infantry ahead of them doubled up their platoon to let the cavalry pass by. The Uhlans set off, pennants flying on their lances, and trotted downhill towards the French cavalry, which had appeared at the foot of the hill to the left. As soon as the Uhlans had gone down the hill, the hussars were ordered to move up the hill to cover the battery. While the hussars took the place of the Uhlans, the bullets came flying from the front line, whining and whistling, missing their aim by far. This sound, which he had not heard for a long time, had a still more joyful and rousing effect on Rostov than the previous sounds of shooting. Drawing himself up, he surveyed the battlefield that opened out from the hill, and participated wholeheartedly in the movements of the Uhlans. The Uhlans flew down close to the French dragoons. Something became confused there in the smoke, and 5 minutes later the Uhlans came racing back, not to the place where they had been, but more to the left. Among the orange Uhlans on chestnut horses, and behind them in a large mass, the blue French dragoons on gray horses could be seen. Section 15. Rostov, with his keen hunter's eye, was one of the first to see these blue French dragoons pursuing our Uhlans. Closer and closer came the disorderly crowds of Uhlans and the French dragoons pursuing them. It was already possible to see how these men, who looked small at the foot of the hill, clashed together, chased each other, and waved their arms or sabers. Rostov watched what was happening before him as if it was a hunting scene. He sensed intuitively that if he were now to strike the French dragoons with his hussars, they would not hold out, but if he were to strike, it would have to be now, at this moment, otherwise it would be too late. He looked around. A captain was standing next to him, his eyes also fixed on the cavalry below. "Andrei Sevastianich," said Rostov, "you know we could crush them." "It would be a daring thing," said the captain, and in fact, Rostov, not hearing him out, nudged his horse, leapt ahead of this squadron, and before he had time to command it to move, the whole squadron, feeling the same as he, set out after him. Rostov did not know himself how and why he was doing it. He did it all as he did at the hunt, not thinking, not reflecting. He saw that the dragoons were near, that they were galloping in disorder. He knew that they would not hold, and he knew that there was only one moment which would not return if he missed it. Bullets whined and whistled so stirringly around him. His horse strained forward so ardently that he could not control himself. He spurred his horse, gave the command, and at the same moment, hearing the hoofbeats of his deployed squadron behind him, started down at a full trot towards the dragoons at the foot of the hill. They had barely reached the foot of the hill when their trot involuntarily turned into a gallop, which became faster and faster as they drew near to our Uhlans and the French dragoons pursuing them. The dragoons were near. The ones in front, seeing the hussars, began to turn back. The ones behind began to slow down. With the feeling with which he raced to intercept a wolf, Rostov, giving his Don horse free rein, galloped to intercept the disordered line of the French dragoons. One Uhlan stopped. One on foot fell to the ground to avoid being crushed. One riderless horse mingled with the hussars. Among all the French dragoons, almost all of the French dragoons were galloping away. Rostov picked himself one on a gray horse and raced after him. On the way he galloped into a bush. The good horse carried him over it, and barely straightening himself into the saddle, Nikolai saw that in a few seconds he would overtake the enemy he had picked out as his target. The Frenchman, probably an officer by his uniform, hunched over, was galloping along on his gray horse, urging it on with his saber. A moment later, Rostov's horse struck the officer's horse in the rump with its breast, almost knocking it down, and at the same moment, Rostov, not knowing why himself, raised his saber and struck the Frenchman with it. The moment he did this, all of Rostov's animation suddenly vanished. The officer fell, not so much from the stroke of the sword, which only cut his arm slightly above the elbow, as from the jolt to his horse and from fear. Reining in his horse, Rostov sought his enemy with his eyes to see whom he had vanquished. The French dragoon officer was hopping on the ground with one foot, the other being caught in a stirrup. Narrowing his eyes fearfully, as if expecting a new blow at any second, he winced, glancing up at Rostov from below with an expression of terror. His face, pale and mud-splattered, fair-haired, young, with a dimple on the chin and light blue eyes, was not at all for the battlefield, not an enemy's face, but a simple, home-like face. Before Rostov decided what to do with him, the officer cried out, "Je me rends! I surrender!" He hurriedly tried, but was unable to disentangle his foot from the stirrup, and his frightened, light blue eyes were fixed on Rostov. Some hussars galloped up to him, freed his foot, and set him in the saddle. Hussars on all sides were busy with the dragoons. One was wounded, but, with his face all covered with blood, refused to surrender his horse. Another, his arms around a hussar, sat on his horse's croup. A third, supported by a hussar, was getting on his horse. In front of them, French infantry came running and shooting. The hussars hurriedly galloped away with their prisoners. Rostov galloped away with the others, experiencing some unpleasant feeling which wrung his heart. Something unclear, confused, something he was unable to explain to himself, had been revealed to him in the capture of this officer and the blow he had given him. Count Osterman Tolstoy met the returning hussars, sent for Rostov, thanked him, and said that he would report his daring action to the sovereign and request the St. George Cross for him. When Rostov was summoned to Count Osterman, he, remembering that his attack had begun without orders, was fully convinced that his superior had called him called for him in order to punish him for unwarranted action. Osterman's flattering words and the promise of a reward should therefore have been a joyful surprise for Rostov, yet the same unpleasant, unclear feeling nauseated him morally. What on earth is tormenting me, he asked himself as he rode back from the general. Ilian? No, he's safe. Did I disgrace myself somehow? No, it's not that. Something else tormented, something like remorse. Yes, that French officer with the dimple, and I remember very well how my arm stopped as I raised it. Rostov saw the prisoners being taken away and rode after them to look at his Frenchman with the dimple on his chin. He was sitting in his strange uniform on a spare hussar horse and looked around uneasily. The wound on his arm was almost not a wound. He feigned a smile at Rostov and waved to him by way of greeting. Rostov still felt awkward and as if ashamed of something. That whole day and the next, Rostov's friends and comrade noticed that he was not dull, not angry, but silent, pensive, and concentrated. He drank reluctantly, tried to stay alone, and kept thinking about something. Rostov kept thinking about that brilliant feat of his, which to his surprise had gained him the St. George's Cross, and even given him the reputation of a brave man. And there was something in it that he was unable to understand. So they're even more afraid than we are, he thought. So that's all there is to so-called heroism? And did I really do it for the fatherland? And what harm had he done with his dimple and his light blue eyes? But how frightened he was! He thought I'd kill him. Why should I kill him? My hand faltered and they gave me the St. George's Cross. I understand nothing. Nothing. But when Nikolai was working out all these questions within himself, still without giving himself a clear accounting of what confused him so much, the wheel of fortune of military service, as often happens, turned in his favor. After the Ostrovna action, he was promoted, was given a battalion of hussars, and whenever a brave officer was called for, the mission was given to him. Section 16. And on receiving the news of Natasha's illness, the Countess, though not quite recovered and still weak, went to Moscow with Petya and all the household, and the whole Rostov family moved from Marya Dmitrovna's to their own house and settled in Moscow. Natasha's illness was so serious that, fortunately for her and for her family, the thought of all that had been the cause of her illness, her act and the break with her fiancé, moved into the background. She was so ill that it was impossible to think of how much she was to blame in all that had happened. While she did not eat, did not sleep, and grew noticeably thinner, coughed, and was, as the doctors let it be felt, in danger. They had to think of only how to help her. Doctors visited Natasha both singly and in consultation, spoke a good deal of French, German, and Latin, denounced one another, prescribed the most varied medicines for all the illnesses known to them. But a simple thought never occurred to any of them that they could not know the illness Natasha was suffering from, as no illness that afflicts a living human being can be known. For each human being has his own peculiarities and always has his own peculiar, complex illness unknown to medical science, not an illness of the lungs, the liver, the skin, the heart, the nerves, and so on, recorded in medicine, but an illness consisting of one of the countless combinations of afflictions of those organs. This simple thought did not occur to the doctors, just as it cannot occur to a sorcerer that he cannot do sorcery, because their life's activity consisted in treating patients, because that was what they were paid for, and because they had spent the best days of their lives doing it. But above all, this thought had not occurred to the doctors because they saw that they were unquestionably useful, and indeed they were useful to all the Rostov household. They were useful not because they made the patient swallow what were, for the most part, harmful substances. The harm was little felt because the harmful substances were given in small quantities. But they were useful, necessary, inevitable, for the same reason that there are, and always will be, imaginary healers, fortune tellers, homeopaths, and allopaths. Because they satisfied the moral need of the sick girl and the people who loved her. They satisfied that eternal human need for hope of relief, the need for compassion and action, which a human being experiences in a time of suffering. They satisfied that external human need, noticeably in a child in its most primitive form, to rub the place that hurts. When a child hurts himself, he runs at once to his mother or nanny's arms to have the place kissed and rubbed, and he feels better once the hurt place is kissed or rubbed. The child does not believe that those who are stronger and wiser than he have no means to help his pain, and the hope of relief and the show of compassion comfort him, while his mother rubs his bump. The doctors were of use to Natasha because they kissed and rubbed her boo-boo, assuring her that it would go away at once if the coachman drove to the Arbat pharmacy and bought 1 ruble and 70 kopecks worth of powders and pills in a pretty box, and if the sick girl made sure to take them with boiled water every 2 hours, not more or less. What would Sonia, the Count and Countess have done? How could they have looked at the weak, wasting Natasha without undertaking anything if it had not been for this taking of pills at specific times, warm drinks, chicken cutlets, and all the details of life prescribed by the doctors, the observance of which constituted the occupation and comfort of everyone around her? The more strict and complicated the rules, the more comforting it was for everyone. How could the Count have borne the illness of his beloved daughter if he had not known that Natasha's illness was costing him thousands of rubles, and that he could not spare thousands more and that he would not spare thousands more to be of use to her? If he had not known that if she did not get better, he would spend thousands more and take her abroad and hold consultations there. If he had had no occasion to talk in detail about how Medivir and Feller had not understood the illness, but Friese had, and Mudrov had diagnosed it still better, what would the Countess have done if she had not been able to quarrel occasionally with the sick Natasha for not fully observing the doctor's prescriptions? That way you'll never get well, she said, forgetting her grief and her vexation. If you don't want to listen to the doctor and take your medicine on time, you shouldn't joke with it. You might get pneumonia, said the Countess. And in pronouncing of this word, incomprehensible not only for herself, she already found great comfort. What would Sonia have done if she had not been joyfully aware that in the beginning she had not undressed for 3 nights so as to be ready to fulfill all the doctor's prescriptions precisely, and that now she did not sleep at night, so as not to miss the time for administering the not too harmful pills from the little gold box? Even Natasha herself, who said that no medicine could cure her and that it was all stupid, even she was glad to see that so many sacrifices were being made for her, that she had to take medicines at certain times, and she was even glad that, by neglecting what had been prescribed, she could show that she did not believe in the treatment and did not value her life. The doctor came every day, felt her pulse, looked at her tongue, and joked with her, paying no attention to her grief-stricken face. On the other hand, when he went out to the other room, the Countess hurriedly followed him, and he, assuming a serious air and shaking his head pensively, said that, although there was danger, he had hopes for the effectiveness of this latest medicine, and they must wait and see. The illness was more moral, but the Countess, trying to conceal this action from herself, and the doctor would put a gold piece in his hand and go back to her daughter, each time with her heart more at ease. The signs of Natasha's illness were that she ate little, slept little, coughed, and never became animated. The doctor said that the sick girl must not be left without medical help, and therefore she was kept in the close air of the city. In the summer of 1812, the Rostovs did not leave the country. Despite the large quantity of pills, drops, and powders she had swallowed from little jars and boxes of which Madame Schoch, a great lover of objects, had assembled a large collection, despite the absence of her accustomed country life, youth had its way. Natasha's grief began to be covered over by the impression of ongoing life. It ceased to weigh with such tormenting pain on her heart, and it began to become the past, and Natasha started to recover physically. And we're going to stop there for today. I said 17, but I meant stopping at 16, stopping before 17. So we'll stop there, and we'll pick it up tomorrow. I hope everyone's staying safe and healthy out there and doing what good you can. Have a great day, and I'll see you tomorrow morning.